the mighty and resilient Merrimack River, carving through the communities of our great region. My name is Linda Lorden, proud president of Merrimack County Savings Bank, and like the river that serves as our namesake, we're a constant yet ever-changing presence. Because to us, it's bigger than banking. It's about powering communities and putting people first. It's about knowing where you came from and where you're going. That's Merrimack style. Visit us at themerrimack.com.
The views and opinions expressed by A Little Bit Culty are those of the hosts and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the podcast. Any of the fucking amazeball content provided by our guests, bloggers, sponsors, or authors are of their opinion and are not intended to malign any religion, group, club, organization, business, individual, anyone, or anything.
We're not doctors, not psychologists, and we're certainly not the AP. That's Associated Press for those of you listening at home. We're two non-experts who found ourselves making a little podcast that people happen to like. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, everybody. Sarah Edmondson here.
And I'm Anthony Ames, a.k.a. Nippy, Sarah's husband, and you're listening to
A Little Bit Culty,
a.k.a. ALBC. A podcast about what happens when devotion goes to the dark side.
We've been there and back again. A little about us. True story. We met and fell in love in a cult. And then we woke up and got the hell out of Dodge.
And the whole thing was captured in the HBO docuseries The Vow, now in its second season.
I also wrote about our experience in my memoir, Scarred, the true story of how I escaped NXIVM, the cult that bound my life.
Look at us, a couple of married podcasters who just happen to have a weekly date night where we interview experts and advocates in things like cult awareness and mind control.
Wait. This does not count toward date night, babe. We got to schedule that. That's separate.
So there's 2 days we got to hang out?
We do this podcast thing because we learned a lot on our exit ramp out of NXIVM. Still on that journey, and we want to pay the lessons forward with the help of other cult survivors and whistleblowers.
We know all too well that culty things happen. It happens to people every day across every walk of life. So join us each week to tackle these culty dynamics, everywhere from online dating to megachurches and multi-level marketing.
This stuff really is everywhere. The cultiverse just keeps on expanding, and so are we. Welcome to Season 5 of A Little Bit Culty, serving cult content and word salads weekly on your favorite podcast platforms. Learn more at alittlebitculty.com.
Sinking down to the depths of the ocean, hanging on to the weight of my love. If I let go of it all, I could leave, but I know I won't.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to A Little Bit Culty.
This one's a doozy.
It is a doozy. And listen, for those of you who are not joining the party on Patreon, you may not have known this, but Nippy and I celebrated our 6-year anniversary of being cult-free last week.
Yeah, that's right. June 1st.
June 1st / May 29th / the weeks leading up to it. It's hard to have an exact date. June 1st is when Nippy did his mic drop.
Officially, I was vocal.
Yeah, when he filed his complaint.
With HR.
Yes.
Yeah.
But Nippy's birthday is a good reminder of our freedom anniversary because we were at his birthday celebrating and freaking out all at the same time 6 years ago.
The celebration was short, if I remember correctly.
Well, we were just really stressed out.
Yeah.
We were really stressed out. And leaving these things is, and I don't think we've talked to anybody who's left and not shared that the leaving part was sometimes the most traumatic. Leaving your community, leaving everything that you've known, in this case for our guest today, something that she was raised in, although it got worse over time, just like the metaphor that we love.
The frog and boiling water metaphor.
If you don't know this metaphor, I apologize.
Jesus.
Well, if you don't know this metaphor, here it is. But if you do know it, I apologize.
I'm just tired of it. I mean, it's not a better one. It's appropriate.
It's such a good metaphor. And if you don't know, I'll just summarize. If you put a frog in boiling water, the frog jumps out immediately. But if the frog is put into room temperature water and gradually brought to a boil, it will not perceive the danger and will be slowly cooked to death. If you've heard about this, then you'll likely haven't heard that some 19th century experiments suggested this was false, that a frog thrown into boiling water will die immediately rather than jump out, and a frog placed in a water that's being brought to a boil will in fact recognize this and escape.
That's some dynamite testing right there.
Animals are not idiots, but that's actually beside the point. Just something to bring up if you want to be an asshole next time someone uses this metaphor like we are. Okay. Either way, I think people
I
understand
think we get it,
that it's a
particularly
slow
people,
burn.
yeah,
a
listening
slow
to
burn.
this. Yeah. The point being is that people are less willing or able to understand danger when the danger is gradual rather than overt and right in your face. Our guest today, Tia Levings, is a textbook example of just that. Having grown up in a Southern Baptist megachurch, Tia had heat applied through several different stages that eventually left her in the midst of fully cooked cult.
This mega church seemed pretty normal on the surface, Tia shared with us, and this said cult followed the wacko principle of federalist marriage, which insists that husbands are responsible for their wives before God, and thus must discipline them as if they are children, often with terrifying violence. Major trigger warning, everybody.
Today, Tia joins us to discuss her, quote, slow boil, starting in the Southern Baptist Church, as well as how she narrowly escaped the pot that was her vicious marriage, along with her 4 children, in order to become an author and advocate for other survivors. We're really milking this metaphor here.
Yes. And we will be doing another episode, by the way, next year regarding her book, which I just loved, but won't be coming out for quite some time, unfortunately for you all, because it's amazing. But before Federalist marriage and before the escape, that gradual rise in heat included the IBLP, a culty group, which is the focus of a new documentary. Yes, people, we are watching it. Shiny, happy people. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the million people who reached out to us.
You might be familiar with the Duggar family, the conservative large family featured on TLC's 19 Kids and Counting. I got to see them all this morning when we did a little preview of the doc. Shiny Happy People reveals the dark side of one of America's most polished and public families, and also how abuse was baked into the DNA of the belief system. Levings was a part of creating the documentary and is here to help break things down for us.
And what was really cool about this interview is that we actually got to meet Tia in person. We were social media friends in the, post-cult space. It's pretty niche, but we became friends there.
What I liked about the interview, number one, it was in person, and you really got to get a sense of her process of evaluating the trauma, how she's processed it, her self-awareness when she speaks. She speaks from a place of understanding it, and it was really great to be in the room and experience that, and we're trying to get her to move to Atlanta. Hint, hint.
Let's just be clear. We recorded this over a month ago, so we hadn't seen the documentary yet. So this is more just about her experience. You can see her in the documentary. Her name's Tia Levings. She's got long, sort of strawberry blonde hair. She's very articulate. And I just share with you, since we didn't capture this on film, that I just finished reading her book, or was just finishing reading her book when she walked into the studio. And, it was very emotional because she's really been through so much. And I hope that comes through in the interview. She is very, very strong, took incredible strength to do what she's done and now speak out about it.
To continue doing it.
And
It's
to
still not
continue
easy,
doing it.
So she's a warrior.
Yeah, a real hero. It was with one of those, you read a book like that and it's just a character in a book. And now she's a real person in front of you, or in front of me. I hope that you read her book too in like a year from now. But until then,
Here's Tia Levings.
enjoy. Welcome to A Little Bit Culty in person.
I know, I'm so stoked.
It's amazing. Nibby doesn't even know how we connected originally. Should we tell him?
Yeah, go for it.
No, you tell. What was your perspective of it?
The Instagram story, the connection, if I'm remembering correctly, because I just went blank. I just did a deer in the headlights thing.
It happens to all.
It does happen to all of us.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I had already seen The Vow. Had I already seen The Vow?
I think so.
And I was so blown away. Like, The Vow is an amazing documentary for a lot of reasons. But one of the big reasons is that you had so many private and personal moments that were captured. And there's these moments like where Mark says he's defending people who fell for a cult. And I was so understood and validated in that moment, reached out, and I think it was a DM conversation. And it just the idea, like Instagram by itself, this big connector. I'm coming off of the heels of having social media shamed again by one of the patriarchs in my story. And social media saves people all of the time because of connection, because we can actually just message one another and someone's going to see it. And that's how this moment happened. That led us here.
I love it. I feel so grateful that we've come out in the era of social media so that we can reach each other. And your story started even before that.
Really, like my story started before there was an internet.
Right.
So
let's start there.
Yeah.
Before there was an internet.
Before there was an internet, when you were isolated, you were truly isolated.
Yeah.
There was not even a hope of an escape line. Even like phone lines could be tapped and stuff, So there was no opportunity to see the modeling of freedom or connect with people outside your worldview. I really point to that first sound of dial-up in my head that I'm remembering as a freedom sound for me, because it was instant portal to a world outside of mine. And I was about 3 years into my suffering at that point, which is synonymous with my marriage, my first marriage. So to turn it on and to hear the sound and then connect with somebody out, like, I like to imagine future me is with me in those moments. And she's like, pay attention, because this, you're going to do something with this. And, we didn't know what the internet was going to do, but I always have a knack for it. And I always kind of did see its potential and followed the rabbit trails so that I just walked through each gate as the internet progressed. I'm an OG adapter to everything because
Or you were opening those gates with
yes,
how you were participating in the internet, right?
Yeah.
That's one way to look at it.
Yeah. Like when they open something for beta, sign me up, because I'm like, well, we'll make something with this. This will be useful.
I want to learn from you, especially your reels and all your TikTok. I'm still catching up. But let's go.
Those are a wealth of information.
Totally. But for the people who are just emerging from under the rock that they're living under and they don't know your story, let's go back to the beginning. So
in the beginning, I looked like a normal evangelical American in the 80s. I went to church sometimes. I lived in Michigan, Upper Peninsula, Michigan. I have 2 very hardworking entrepreneurial parents. We went to church sometimes. They had religion in their background. They did value it. And I did have some early religious trauma, like primarily through hell teachings, lake of fire, a literal hell, and that you do have to be saved. And things that were said to me when I was 6 that would put me, if nothing else had happened in my story, that I would still have some religious trauma to unpack, because that's scary shit to say to a 6-year-old.
Yeah.
And I, as an artistic, free spirit, roaming kid who was, a poet and writer in my heart, and I took everything and internalized it. So when they told me that I, have to pray this prayer or be separated from God, separated from my parents, separated from everything I know, I felt like I killed Jesus. That's a heavy thing to put on a 6-year-old. So that seemed like a lot of people will relate to that. A lot of people will think, okay, well, that's not so culty, what's going to happen. And unbeknownst, like in the background, I think it's important to share in my story, America was changing from the 80s. That's the Reagan era on. And the evangelical church was becoming more fundamentalist and more political in the background. And so that is a
During
through
the
line.
Reagan years.
During the Reagan years, when
Reagan
they coalesced
years.
around a single issue with abortion, they realized they could just combine all of the conservative Christian population under one voting platform. They would have the political power that they needed to change the country.
They leverage an issue.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that started in the 80s. So what I like, this parallel through line of my story. A Michigan economy tanked. My parents needed work. They moved to Florida. And for a sense of belonging, they joined this big mega church. And mega churches are starting to fade. There's still a few of them, but they were a big hot thing in the late 80s.
They were also put on cable TV.
And we were on TV every Sunday. We had this big auditorium, sat like 3,500 people, and we had 3 services. So like a 10,000 member church in the 90s. And
this was real on television.
It's real, 11 city blocks, and it's the place to be, and everyone's shiny and glorious, and they have answers to all the problems. My parents are in their young 20s. They have 2 little girls. They're struggling for work. They are in a new city. Everything was new to me. I had not seen a Black person. I had not seen a city. I had not been out of the countryside. It's massive culture shock. So church offered all the solutions to everything. They really had a big budget. They had plenty of clout in Jacksonville, lots of money. And so pretty soon, like in a whisper, I'm going to church 6-7 times a week. Wow. And it is every single day.
So from that move, that's when
so then you're in. It's your world. You're saturated.
Got it.
And saturated in things like purity culture, over-sexualized teachings, high control, fear-based evangelicism. A lot of listeners will be familiar with like the rapture story, and purity culture is a big one that people will relate to. Like everything is monitored. We were taught, like I learned what an orgy and a golden shower were when I was 12 from a pastor in a sermon. Like,
I had a note about that.
Yes.
I had a note.
I just learned what that stuff was.
That's totally inappropriate for children. But a lot of that was, and it was meant to scare us into virginity, because the whole program was designed to get us to be virgins, wait until we were married, get married young, have a lot of children, and begin to propagate the Christian message by population. I didn't know it at the time, but we had these special Christians in our church, this extra holy kind of person. And they were attending these stadium events through Bill Gothard's Institute of Basic Life Principles. And those were held all over the nation. And they are multi-denominational, so that he would come in and he would connect with all the prominent religious leaders of the area and infiltrate churches. Like people would come from all kinds of churches, Baptist, Pentecostal, Church of God, Assemblies of God, all these different denominations. And they would come to learn more about the Bible because they all agreed the Bible, is our book. We have different expressions of it, but it's our book. And then they would come back into their churches and they would try to evangelize for the ATI Institute of Basic Life Principles method and lifestyle. They would evangelize within their churches. They become leadership as deacons and Sunday school teachers. And they were set apart. And you did know who they were because they had a row of children at a time when it was still 2.5 was the average. And that was true in church too. And women were starting to work and, marriages were starting to strain because they didn't have any guidance for how to balance two working parents. So IBLP comes in and says, we have a solution for all this suffering. We can help your family stay intact. We can help your marriages thrive. We can be fruitful and multiply and spread this message across America, and they will see our superior lifestyle. So I knew they were there in my mega church, but they were these exotic, super holy people that I didn't really come into contact with because I was a kid.
This is the God.
They're the Gothard people,
Gothard,
yeah.
Okay.
We don't really have a name for them.
So it's kind of the savior group within the savior group.
Yeah, exactly. Like and you do have those class systems in big churches like that.
Yeah.
You have the people that are being saved and they're always the projects. I think your book calls them parasites, as would be a parallel. They're the needy people that just always need, and you're there to minister to them and they're always sucking off of you. And then you have the leadership and they're on a different class. And then we had these super holy leaders and they weren't the pastors. They were like extra. And I'm an observant kid. So I'm like, what's going on there? They have an organ pipe row. We had these pipe organs that were like graduated columns, like, because we had the biggest pipe organ in, I think, the world at the time in our church. And you could see the heads of the children that are like organ pipes. Like there's like 10 children and they're all Irish twins because they're all 10 months apart all the way down.
You call it the organ pipe row?
Yes, I did.
Awesome.
Because I studied them. I sat on the stage. I played the flute in the orchestra and I would look at them and I'd be like, what do they have that is so extra? I want to know what that is. I was so curious because it was so the aesthetic. And this aesthetic is a very big piece of this whole story. They were a happy, intact family. They were living against the grain. They loved little house on the prairie and homesteading and canning and baked bread and homeschooling and all these things that looked lovely. Like, why wouldn't you want that? Especially if you're coming from a family like where there's tension maybe because they don't have their relationship figured out or they're working really hard and they're on the verge of divorce or the divorce rate's rising or your pastor's telling you, that we have a responsibility to stay married for life and be a witness to the world. And, so you're just always looking for this formula for life. And fundamentalism does that across the board. It'll promise a formula for happy living and to remove the suffering from the world. So people who don't want to suffer will say, okay, what do I need to do? What are the steps I need to take in order to be happy? And
which is normally suffering.
Yeah. There's some irony involved in their steps.
You just answered our first three questions. What was a mega church? What was Southern Baptist? What was your family's relationship like with Christianity?
That was impressive, by the way.
Yeah. What generation got pulled in? You answered all that. You were fundamentalism by mentors that followed Gothard.
Yes,
Institute
that's an important
IBLP.
turning point in the story, though.
Yes.
So I graduated.
Yeah.
And when I say that, I don't mean that I graduated high school because I did. Of course, I did. I graduated the church's agenda. I was an 18-year-old virgin who was going to get married to the person who showed up and said, I'm the one who's going to marry you. There is no, this is important context. There is no like chemistry, dating process that where you're like evaluating if you want to marry this person.
Right.
You accept the person who says that they're the one for you.
And
that's how
God
you
sent
know
them.
that God said it.
Right.
Because the wrong person would never announce that they're the right person.
That's
Oh my God.
makes no
Oh
sense.
my God.
But yeah, I get
Yeah,
it.
exactly.
Yeah,
It makes no sense. But it did to us because
Yeah.
we're like, okay.
Well, no, I can see how it.
Yeah. If you
Well,
believe
yeah.
that God's controlling everything, it's God's will.
and
then
they speak through men.
and they speak through men and men know everything and women have to obey them.
Mhm.
Then if a man shows up and says, I'm going to marry you, you're like, oh, I'm so lucky.
I'm so lucky and I
Yeah.
will retrofit every dream I have around you as the star now.
Yeah.
So I was just waiting for my prince to come. Someday my prince will come. And he came and he said,
And
I'm
how
your
was
prince.
that decided? What is their process like in choosing a spouse?
Well, I know how he chose me. I was 18. I had size D breasts, long red hair, and I was thin.
Mhm.
That's why he chose me. I was
Yeah.
attractive to him. And he came from a broken home. He wasn't raised in the same megachurch. He was raised Southern Baptist, so he had all the same theology.
Yeah.
I didn't have a chance to understand his psychology or understand what kind of broken patterns were involved or anything, because he also came with narcissistic tendencies and abuse from the start. And they are very charming in the beginning. And I know now, what I didn't know then was that somebody like that who sees what they want and they go after it and they're charming for it, they cannot hold that up for very long. So they have to secure you very quickly.
Mhm.
I was engaged within a month of meeting him, and I thought I was caught up in a romance. And it would be years before I realized he secured me that quickly because he could not keep his facade up longer than that. I would have had second thoughts or backed off or said no to a date or something like that if we'd just been dating. So it was really
Right.
important that I was already hiding shameful secrets and that I was already secured and locked down and told my family, and I was accountable to this story that I was now participating in and complicit from the beginning.
Would you say a lot of the men are like that because of how they're raised?
Not all of them intentionally or in a hurtful way, but I would say the majority of them are. And that's a hard truth to sit with, because as soon as you say that, I think of nice guys that I grew up with that
Right.
meant well.
Mm-hmm.
And they're really trying to please God and they're trying to do the right thing. And one of the things I say a lot is that in fundamentalism, everyone suffers. There is this idea that this is man-hating and that we're just the men are all bullies. And they're not. They're caught up in a toxic
Right.
system. And they suffer as well. They're held to a standard they can't
It's
support
not
or hold on.
proprietary to them. It's a system that
Exactly.
reinforces itself.
And
Yeah.
it harms everyone.
Yeah.
They have no resources for their
They're screwed
psychological
too.
health.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it just
Totally.
becomes a toxic soup where everybody pays
Yeah, yeah.
pays a price.
There was one big red flag with Alan right from the beginning.
Yes. So from the
We're
beginning,
going, we're going to the beach now?
It's not the
Are
kind
we
of
going to the beach?
Exterior shot beach.
Yeah.
This is a tiny bit, a little bit of a book spoiler. So, but it's an important red flag. We had been dating and were engaged. It was about the 6-week mark. He lived with a house full of roommates, guys he was in the Navy. So these were all sailors and they were sharing rent and living on the cheap and spending all their money on their girlfriends. And so I had met all of his roommates at a hayride, the same hayride where I met Alan. And I had met all of them. And I was fresh off of a breakup and I was just having fun. And I was vivacious that night and having a good time and said hi to everybody. And even now, as I tell that story, I'm like making sure I wasn't doing anything wrong.
Right.
But it's like the most ordinary thing.
Yeah.
I went to a hayride with my friends and I laughed and I played chess and I played foosball and I sucked on candy canes and I sang Christmas carols. And 6 weeks later, I was cuffed in the throat on the beach and left on the beach in the dark. We were there alone. It was a nor'easter. He designed it. He's like, let's go have a walk on the beach alone when nobody else will be there. I like romantic storms. And so I was like, sure, I'll go walk on the beach with you. And I had no reason to mistrust him because it had been lovely until that point. And the violence came at me so quickly, there wasn't even time to flinch. And I was so, I think probably in shock. I just didn't know what to do and tried, like he left the beach and I didn't know he was going to get the car. But so I was walking around in the dark trying to think of like, I'm going to call my dad. I'm going to, I'm scrambling, like what I'm going to do. As I get to the end of the pier, like the pier goes 2 ways. So it goes like out in the water, but then it also like goes beyond the sand to the parking lot. And he came up in the car and told me to get in the car. And then he sped us home. And then he sexually assaulted me in the bushes before I went into the house. And it wasn't complete sexual assault. Like there was no penetration or anything like that. But it was more than I had been touched or knew what to do with because I had only known him for 6 weeks. And I was completely, I had done the good Christian girl thing. So nobody had kissed me or touched me. And now I had a secret I had to hold. So now I was locked down because who am I going to tell? I had gone to the beach alone. I had done all, like, we do have to like put in context.
Yeah, no,
we
you're
have those conversations now openly.
Mhm.
It doesn't matter what she's wearing.
Right.
But 30 years ago, we didn't have those conversations. I had put myself in that situation and I had accepted that this person was my spiritual head and leader now. And I'm not allowed to say no to him for anything. And I'm not allowed to, like, all the rules now applied to me
Did you feel
as a
that in
wife
that
in
moment?
training. Yeah, it was like, I have to protect him
Wow.
and I have to obey him and I'm fucked. I didn't say fucked. I said I'm screwed, but because I couldn't even cuss in my head at that
Wow.
age.
That's actually a
Poor
line
baby.
that you said later, but it applies to this moment
Mhm.
because you weren't married yet. But you said, like a good wife, I protected our image more than our safety.
Yeah.
Your
Okay, I
your
got
safety.
chills.
Yeah.
That's the public relations that go on in this lifestyle is one of the hardest shame pieces to shed later. It has taken me a long time to contend with it. I'm a visual person. I'm a photographer. I was always taking pictures, lovely pictures. I was always capturing this and curating this lovely image of my happy family. My parents never even knew about the abuse, and we lived 2 blocks away for a big chunk of our marriage. Nobody knew what was going on in my home because I did a really rock star job of the image and the facade and of keeping the secrets. I mean, when you grow up in high control religion and you learn how to keep a secret, and I know this from other survivors, it's a superpower for us. We are so good, and we've lied to ourselves too. So maintaining his image, it did a lot of things. It propped up his ego. It helped me control the narrative that it was going to be okay. And I was reassuring. I needed it to be okay. I absolutely did. And
That's
I also,
your currency.
Yes,
In a lot of ways.
it is.
Yeah.
It absolutely is. I wanted my children to have an intact 2-parent family. And you're not allowed to get divorced in this world. Like, death is preferable to divorce, and they're very open about that. And it wasn't until I was facing my own annihilation that I was willing to leave. So, of course, I'm going to hold up the image. And there was one point in my story where I break down and I do open the door and let somebody in, and I'm shamed and shut down so quickly that I learn I'm not going to do that again. Yeah.
This is the golden age of cult recovery. The more we speak up and share our stories, the more we realize we are not alone. Your voice and your story can empower others. This is Sarah, and I'm proud to be a founding collaborator of the #IGotOut movement. Learn more at igotout.org.
The Frankies were a picture-perfect influencer family, but everything wasn't as it seemed.
I just had a 12-year-old boy show up here asking for help. He's emaciated. He's got tape around his legs. Ruby Frankie is his mom's name.
Infamous is covering Ruby Frankie, the world of Mormonism, and a secret therapy group that ruined lives. Listen to Infamous wherever you get your podcasts.
Meals bring people together, but for many families, providing their next meal can be a challenge. You can help by participating in Macy's annual Feeding the Hungry food drive. All proceeds go toward local food banks and families. Now through January 31st, you can purchase an icon in-store or online, or watch out for the blue Feeding the Hungry shelf tags, where a portion of your purchase will be donated to local pantries. Together, we can combat hunger in our local communities at Macy's.
I was thinking about the core beliefs that hold that whole thing in place, because it is hard, you're right, in 2023 to look at this and understand the context and the backdrop of what was holding all this in place. But one of them is that there's a God, right? And God knows best, right? God,
And he knows everything and sees absolutely everything you think and do.
Right. And then
So AI.
AI, there's zero privacy.
It's like AI,
zero privacy.
right. So there was the surveillance is everywhere. And then that God's like chosen this man for you, and now he's in charge.
Right.
Right. So, and he's the only way to God, which is salvation. So like, you really have to like put yourself into that mindset and believe it to its core to imagine everything else that happens around it.
It is the highest stakes. There is no decision making a woman has to make. You get saved, and then God takes the decisions from there. And then you get married, and your husband is the voice box of God taking the decisions from there. So when you, like, let's take a little example. You ask a 30-year-old woman what she'd like for dinner, and she can't tell you. It's because she has no practice making, with her own autonomy to even decide what she would like to eat.
They sold slavery as salvation.
Exactly.
It's the mindfuck of all these things.
We enslaved ourselves. We gaslit ourselves.
Look at what's going on there is what's going on a little bit in our culture. And anyway.
One of the things I loved about your book, how you brought the reader into the inner monologue of the sort of back and forth between the two Tias.
Oh, yeah.
And the sort of separation of yourself, your true self, versus your idealized Christian fundamentalism.
It would be the cult identity.
Yeah. Stephen Hassan calls it the pre-cult identity.
We're throwing some cult lingo in.
Right. I appreciate his work so much.
He puts language to a lot of this stuff.
He really does.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have these sort of like, almost like a split personality.
Yeah.
You're an obedient wife, and your artist, writer, mother, hiker friend.
I am so grateful for this sense of self, because I think it's the reason I survived.
Yes.
So my first 10 years, I mentioned I grew up on this farm, and my parents and Gen X both of those work together. I was a bit of a feral kid, and so is my generation. We're a little feral, left on our own, latchkey kids if you lived in the city. But where it looked like for me was that I could wander the fields and the trees, and we had 80 acres. And I was a very young child doing this, inappropriately young. I think my mom and I both agree on that now. I would wander for hours and get lost in swamps, and there would be search parties, and I would see bears and things like that. I think it had to do with coming home. I liked being welcomed home, and they would stop what they were doing to look for me. I think that's what was going on. Mm-hmm. But what it resulted in was this really strong sense of self. I know how to carry myself. I know how to be alone. I know how to get myself out of sticky situations. And I had my first real spiritual experience with God alone in the trees, not at church. So I always carried that with me, and it cost me often because it was a streak of rebellion or it was a spirit of disobedience. They had names for this unbreakability. I would not be fully broken, and I was always asserting myself. So having these entrepreneurial parents and coming from this environment, I have a can-do spirit. My dad's motto is "you gotta wanna." And so I'm like, I can do this. And I threw myself, like, the homesteading life is no shit. It's a ton of work. Mm-hmm. Having 5 children is a ton of work. Having home births, ton of work. You need a lot of strength and fortitude for that. So I would bring my whole self to the situation. And then they would tell me, back it up. You got to get back in the box. You not so loud, Tia, or you're sticking out too much, Tia, or, stuff like that. And I'm like the only one in a room who's doing something often. And my friends would say, you always know when Tia's in the room. And like, that's a bad thing. Now I'm like, hell yeah, you always know when Tia's in the room. Yeah. But I didn't know how to own that when I was a kid. And when I was a young wife and I was a young mom and I was doing a really good job of running a household and providing my kids the stability, that saved their childhood. It also helped save me, but it also helped me have kind of a shield, like throw a little bit of a shield that the fundamentalist teachings that I was trying so hard to externally manifest, I never gave them my whole heart. And that shred of little heart and self that was left is what got me through the escape and the 10 years of survival that came after. We were in hiding. There's a lot of stressful things that happened in the aftermath that if I had not had that sense of self, I wouldn't have had any piece of me to come back to.
So how old were you when you made that transition from your childhood?
I was 9 when we moved.
So you had a little bit of, you knew yourself a little.
Being young parents, being married, all of that in this, because so much of your story is positioned towards, like, it seems like single career people coming in and being absorbed. And so then, like the married couples stick out to me. Like, if you know anything about his sexual harassment charges, he likes to stroke girls' feet and then say he's not touching them in a sexual way.
Disgusting.
These are girls who are not allowed to touch the opposite sex under any circumstances.
The loopholes.
What's happening with quick tangent? What's happening with his? Is he like?
It was voluntarily dismissed.
Yeah,
it was a class action suit, and it was voluntarily dismissed because the victims were being re-traumatized through the process.
Fill our audience in on what
the IBLP was going through.
Can you give us a little background on that? But then we'll come back to you.
Yes. So IBLP is hitting some hard times. Yeah. I think it was 2015. We have to probably double check the year, but there was a class action suit that was brought against girls who had worked for him. Mm-hmm. We know them as Gothard girls. He has a type that he would hire as secretaries and assistants, and they were always like slightly wounded, underage
broken
girls.
Birds?
Yes, broken birds with a very perfect, certain angelic quality of their hair and a neediness and a reverence for Mr. Gothard. And they would work for him and then have these experiences with him. And when they got older, they compared notes and they filed this suit. And it was, I believe, voluntarily dismissed because they were being re-traumatized through the legal process of what it's like to go up against somebody like that with powerful attorneys and the long process. And so it was quietly settled. I do believe all of those claimants, or a good portion of those claimants, are in the same documentary that I'm in. So this story will be shared more in depth because it is an expose of the IBLP. So his sexual transgressions and the reason he's no longer on the board will all be
But he's still
revealed.
out in the public.
He is, but he lives with his sister and he's old and he's a toad. So, I mean, out in the public as much as,
He's not like doing sermons. Speaking of toads, when did it go? So then it goes into the Federalist when you got married.
We shouldn't make that leap yet.
Oh, no. Okay. Okay.
We skipped too much.
Okay, sorry. You tell me.
Let's back up and get, because I haven't even really touched Bill Gothard yet.
Oh, yeah. Okay, you do.
Right.
Thank God.
I have never touched Bill Gothard. Thank God.
For the record.
No. So he was holding these stadium events. And by now, the Gothard Rise in our megachurch was a big holding. And now you had a large group of people that were homeschooling. And we started to have homeschool conventions. And this was a longer lifestyle. I was a new bride and I was quickly pregnant. And desperate to keep my baby quiet and my household structured. It was very immediately in domestic violence that I didn't know to call it that. I just thought that we had fights. I was raped 3 times on my wedding night. I didn't know it was rape until I escaped. So I was experiencing things I didn't have any language for. I just knew I was suffering and in pain, and I had a new baby, and I had to keep my household quiet and well-ordered. And I had been reading this book called Fascinating Womanhood. If you've seen my reels, I cover this pretty deeply. Helen B. Anlin is a writer who wrote this book the same year that The Feminine Mystique came out as kind of a counter to feminism. And it teaches women to be childlike and angelic for their husbands. And there's a lot of emphasis on childlike. And this book had 9 printings, 5 million copies were sold. There's these workshops. A lot of people have felt the influence of Fascinating Womanhood in our culture, in our feminized culture, without realizing the source material, because people don't go around saying that you should do this because it says so in this book, you know? So like a lot of people are like, I've never heard of that book. There's no way it could have influenced me. It's like, if you knew the contents of it, and then you'd have like some lifestyle threads to it. But so I was reading this book and I was trying to become a domestic goddess and have this very proper, like you can't laugh too loud. You can't wear plaid. You have to dress in certain fabrics. You have to make him the king of his home. You have to never question him, call him a hairy brute, make him feel strong.
Call him a hairy brute?
Yeah. It makes him feel manly if you beat your chest
Like
on.
that. Oh, you're so
big,
strong.
Exactly. Well done,
Really?
Sarah.
Yeah.
She just
You're
modeled
so
it
strong.
perfectly.
They
manly.
encourage you to do that?
In print, yes. It's actually in the book. And I was like,
Can we keep that one? I kind of like that one.
see, these work.
They like
They
it.
work in a fun way. And I did
I'm
not have a
not
fun
condoning this.
husband. I had very well. I had a theology-loving, struggling young husband who needed some medication and support. He was not the kind of guy that the books would
Right.
assume a goodwill.
It's not a hairy brute.
He was a hairy brute, but if I beat on his chest, I would have been smacked in the next week. Like, you don't play. You don't play. I did hit him once when he called me a whore, and he dragged me down the hall by my hair. And his signature move is head into doorframe, because I have a lot of hair. All of my injuries are here because they're not here, because that would show. So I was not dealing with the kind of man that I could take a lot of this advice. So I needed a mentor. So I take my baby into the nursing room at church, because we have this nursing room where all the women sit and breastfeed. And so they're not in public breastfeeding. They have this designated place. One of the special Christian moms was in there. Actually, 4 or 5 of them were. And I had an opportunity to ask them now, what's special about you? What are you doing that's different in this church? How are you, like, please teach me. There's a verse in Titus 2 that says, let the older women teach the youngers to love their husbands and to be keepers of the home. And so you're supposed to, as a young woman, ask an older woman, how am I supposed to do this? And I like the mentorship model. It makes a ton of sense. Like,
For sure.
you don't know what you know, like ask somebody who knows and they'll teach you, usually from the goodness of their heart.
Again, before the internet.
Before the internet,
Yeah,
we had,
yeah.
if we wanted to research something, you go to the library and you hope they have books, and then you hope you have the cojones to like ask for the topic. Like there's a lot of, you don't even ask the librarian stuff, like the things that we secretly
Well, there's
Google.
more emotional barriers to get the information.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you have to make photocopies, 15 cents a page. Like it's not.
Right.
It's not
that shit adds up.
and like, what am I going to say?
Yeah.
I mean, you've heard enough of my story. What would you,
Right.
what would you
Right.
search?
Yeah.
I didn't even know that I had an abnormal marriage, because everyone around me was doing the same thing.
And you weren't talking.
We weren't talking.
No.
We weren't allowed to talk. Most of the women in my Sunday school class would giggle about anything sexual, or they would groan because their husbands wanted it so much. My husband touched me once a year for 5 minutes. Well, how am I going to relate to somebody who's complaining that they get it all the time? Like, and I knew I was never supposed to say no, but I was like, really? This is marriage? Like, aren't we going to have fun and try? You know, there was no affection like that. So I was lonely and I was struggling, and I knew I had to, this was my life. Like, I need to fix this problem, because I have always said I'm on the 120-year plan and I want to be here for a long time and live life. Like I have this joy for life. And so I wanted to make this happy. I wanted my children to have a happy childhood. So I reached for somebody who is a professional. She's got 10, 12 children, and they're all smiling and they're all sitting in a row. Please tell me what you're doing. So that's how I become mentored by Gothardites. And that leads me to a whole host of other, I call them villains in my story. Michael Pearl with his really harsh discipline of infants, Doug Wilson with his federal marriage, Doug Phillips with his Vision Forum, which is now defunct.
These are all real names.
They're all real names. They're all real pastors and industry leaders, and you can read about their controversies online. And some of them are fallen and some of them are thriving.
Which is the one that had the glue stick?
That's Michael Pearl. And he teaches that you should switch a 4-month-old infant as soon as they're starting to be mobile to stay on a blanket. Because if you want them to, really teaching them suppression, you're teaching them to never cry or explore or make any movement other than sit on the blanket and be quiet. And so you use a switch and you use glue sticks because real switches, like wood from a tree, will dry out and they'll break, and that's not good. So you use these crafting glue sticks. And I couldn't do it. It's an infant. It's a 4-month-old. They're this big still, but you're teaching them, like they call it child training.
And training a dog.
Because they call it child training and they call it, and dog people came all on me when I posted about this online. Dog people are like, we don't treat our dogs that bad.
Right.
Like, fundies are way worse to their kids than the dog trainers are to their children. So
It
that's
broke
how
my
she
heart.
had her children quiet in church, because they're taught from infancy, you don't get off the blanket. If you touch the line, you're going to get
Explain
switched.
the glue sticks they were hitting the kids with, not
Yes.
actually putting in the glue.
No, you're switching and
Okay.
leaving a line.
Like
So-
whipping.
Yeah, no, I
so
understand. Okay.
You follow the
All right.
math. You have a baby with lines on its legs. You're not going to a well check. You're not going to the pediatrician. You're not going to the doctor. You're not going out in public. You're not inviting any mandatory reporters into your child's life. Like, you are suddenly, your world's gotten a lot smaller. Like I said, this was a line I couldn't cross. I do eventually spank my children at one point in the story, but it's not as infants. And their language allows them to do this in plain sight. It comes from Calvin, and lots of churches have flavors of it. But at its most rigid, puritanical, ideological expression, which is what today's neo-Calvinist teaches, humans are worms who need a savior, which are too gross to be saved. So Jesus died to save some of you. And if you're elect, you won't know it, but you have to be elect in order to go to heaven. And if you're not elect, you are going to hell with everyone else. He only died for that little bit that is saved, that is truly elect. You cannot say no to it because it's irresistible. And you will be preserved through your doubts because you're elect. So if you are the person who believes you're a worm, you have to be elect to be saved. He only died for some of us. And you're doubting and you're struggling, that's probably evidence that you're not elect, because you're not being preserved through that process.
That's a very
It's a lot of loopholes too.
Yeah.
You could
Yes.
play with. Yeah.
Imagine swimming in a cycle
Yeah.
like that.
yeah.
Hey there, listener. Hope you're enjoying this episode and that you're taking deep breaths when we cover the enraging stuff that cult jerks are up to. Let it out, as in the yoga practice. Inhale positivity, exhale negativity. That's for you, Sarah. We got this. No hulking it out, all you little hulksters. And if you need some helpful resources on the topic of cult recovery, check out our website at alittlebitculty.com. And now, here's a brief message from our sponsors.
Meals bring people together, but for many families, providing their next meal can be a challenge. You can help by participating in Macy's annual Feeding the Hungry food drive. All proceeds go toward local food banks and families. Now through January 31st, you can purchase an icon in-store or online, or watch out for the blue Feeding the Hungry shelf tags, where a portion of your purchase will be donated to local pantries. Together, we can combat hunger in our local communities at Macy's.
Shop Plato's Closet tax-free August 2nd through 4th for back-to-school styles. We sell the trendy, gently used styles you need to make a difference in the world and in your wallet for back-to-school shopping. Save up to 70% off regular retail prices by choosing recycled styles. Save even more when you shop tax-free this weekend. Make a change that others can respect and repeat. Shop Plato's Closet in North Charleston and West Ashley this year for your back-to-school looks. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.
That's the Federalist?
That's the Calvinist.
Okay, so where
Yeah.
do the
And that
Federalist?
was our word salad segment. Of the show.
Oh, no, we have so many gems. I don't want to skip them. Yeah.
I know, and we don't have to encapsulate, because we want people to read your book too,
Right.
and go through the whole journey.
I know we're gonna have to resist
and,
tangents.
and there's so many
This is
tangents.
so
and
good. It's so interesting.
it is so interesting, and so many iterations of what your journey went through, led by Alan.
Mhm.
Desire. Is that his real name, by the way, or not? No.
No.
Did you know that Keith's middle name is Alan?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, and we actually call him that because we don't like saying his real name, so we call him Alan. So the fact that his name was Alan, I was like,
Oh,
it's a sign.
it's a sign.
Yeah, but that's where things got really quite dark, right? Was with the Federalists.
They really did,
Yeah.
because before the Federalists, my family, I could still go to church with my family, the Baptist church. I could still, a lot of the Christian culture that's like a lot of be blessed and love and light and all of that stuff. We could participate in that stuff. You still have this like channel to be a good Christian wife and be the best Christian you can. So when you look at women's ministries in evangelicism and they're headed by a woman, that's an example of stay in your swim lane, but you can be visible. You can teach other women. You can have ministries. You can have Bible studies. You can get together on Tuesdays. There's a Hobby Lobby for everyone, you know, like there's a place for you in that world. When we get into Calvinism and federalism, everything changes and gets really dark really fast. I feel right now that I'm scared for Nippy because you haven't told him this part.
I told him a little bit.
Yeah.
I told him a little bit.
She braced me for a little bit. I'll be okay.
Because these are jaw-dropping realities and they're very careful. If you've followed so far with the story of how one pastor leads to another pastor and one book leads to another book, they're not just chains, they're building blocks. So everything that I learned in Gothard with the lifestyle, behavior modification, nutrition control, fasting, denial of self, he has a whole teaching method that is such a mind fuck. Everything that we had in Gothardism was this foundation. And then they had, we have to have resources for everything. So homeschooling has a resource and there's all these teachers, and Michael Pearl comes in with his how to train your children, because when you have the ideal that you have to attain, you have to have methods to attain these ideals. So everybody has their thing. Like Terry Maxwell had managers of their home where we divided our home into 15-minute increments and we have color-coded charts so that every single thing is ascribed to. You have a moment to be like one-on-one with each child at least once a day for 15 minutes. And that sounds like a beautiful thing, right? I'm going to spend that. But they don't actually attain that. And most of the things on the chart don't happen. So in a big quiverful family, you have some ugly truths just because of population control in your household. Incest is a real big problem. Neglect is a real big problem. Medical neglect and injuries not being treated properly. Parentification of the oldest sibling is rampant.
Can you explain that?
Parentification is when the oldest sibling is relied upon to help raise the children. And it is done on purpose. Like that happens in all families that are large by virtue, like oldest sibling, those stories exist. But in quiverful methodology, it's on purpose. You're having your older children become pseudo-parents by the time they're about 5 years old. The oldest daughter is still she's in her 30s and she's not married. She's there to help raise her siblings. And they're called the stay-at-home daughters, which the acronym means SAD. And it's a whole thing. They have their own survivors that come out of that movement. Their job is to serve their siblings, serve their fathers until they're courted off in an arranged marriage. And if their parents need their employment or their help, they're not going to arrange their marriage so that they can go be moms to their own children. So what you end up with is a survivor base that has been parenting children since the time they were 5, and they're tired. They don't want always to become parents by the time they're adults because they've been doing an adult lifestyle for a long time.
So I have heard this term a lot, and I haven't deep dived, and our audience is probably dying to know, what is a quiverful anyway?
Yeah. So quiverful is based on a verse in the Bible. It equates children to arrows in a war. So it says, happy is the man that has his quiver full of them. Children are like arrows unto the Lord. Happy is the man who has his quiver full of them. So when you're going into war, you want as many arrows as possible, right? You wouldn't say, no, I think I've got enough arrows. And, so because you're objectifying children as weapons of war, and because you believe you're in a cultural holy war for God, you're going to have as many soldiers as possible. And so you do not use birth control, and you have as many babies as you humanly can produce.
Wow. Okay.
So just to offer another layer of cultural context, when the Roe v. Wade report, the thing was leaked, Alito's draft was leaked, and they used the domestic supply of babies language. They were referring to adoption, but they're also referring to, we have to keep our population here. It's all about domination through population growth. And it comes into play with abortion issues, and it comes into play with birth control and family size and resources. And they are not talking about general population. They don't want everybody to have a lot of babies. They want Christian families that are going to produce a certain kind of holy soldier to have a lot of babies. So you're talking about white Christian families. We want lots of white Christian babies in America.
Well, that explains a few things.
It does.
It does, yeah.
Anything else you want to say about that topic?
Nope.
Okay.
I think I covered it.
Yeah, let's leave it there.
Pretty much.
Okay. So if you don't want to give this away for your book, that's totally fine. But I would like to talk about domestic discipline.
Yes. Okay. So it's called Christian domestic discipline. You can Google that. I didn't see it coming. It was something that caught me totally by surprise. I mentioned earlier when we were talking about child training, we have very acceptable language for it. This is called correction. This is called teaching children to obey their parents, honor your mother and father. A little detail in Michael Pearl's book is he doesn't really have an age limit of when you should stop spanking your child. And he has examples of older children in their teens being still disciplined with corporal punishment by their parents. And then you have lots of resources that talk about transferring authority from the father to the husband. And then you have teaching like, I'm just going to build the blocks for you here. You have teachings from Federal Marriage and Doug Wilson that a husband is responsible for the spiritual condition of his entire family. Absolutely everything that happens in his household, including his wife's thought life, he is accountable to God for. So when you imagine, you put yourself in his place, he's going to stand in front of the maker of the universe and account for what happens in his family. He's charged with making sure that she obeys, that she's staying in her place, and he's going to use whatever corrective measures he needs to employ to do that. So that's where wife correction comes in. And they will talk about that more openly too. They will say husbands should correct your wives. You should teach your wives. You should be the one that she comes to for the answers to her questions. And that's how they talk about it in polite company. What was happening in the early aughts was that web forums were becoming a thing. And you had these like pastors that had magazines and they had columns. And then you could subscribe to their tapes because we didn't have podcasts or radio shows or anything like that. You could subscribe and have their tapes sent to you. And then you could get on these discussion forums behind a paywall and you could talk about, men could share ideas. Well, how do you correct your wife? And, how are you leading your home to be, how are you this godly husband? And that sounds fine too, right? Except they're exchanging suggestions for how to discipline your wife. And so that's where Christian domestic discipline comes in, because it's called taken in hand. And it's where husbands are responsible to correct their wives as if they're children, because he's the king of the household and everyone else is a level playing field. There's not a team. There's we don't have egalitarian marriage. It's complementary. And so she's already under him. And in our word salad thing, I sent you the umbrella of authority. So if you're familiar with Gothard's umbrella system, Christ, and then the husband's under Christ, and then the wife is under the husband, and then the children are underneath the wife. And then the pastor's just kind of out here not accountable to anybody. But that takes that model and says everybody is under the husband. And in federal marriage, actually, it takes the stack away and makes it more of a level thing. Like Wilson calls them the fiefdom. It's the family. The family is his fiefdom. And he is the king, and she is to call him my Lord and bow and show reverence. And there's a lot of sexual things involved because Wilson's a very sexualized pastor. And discipline came into my home in the form of this web forum. He surprised me one day as a way to control domestic violence. If he had a way to channel his anger and channel his frustration with me, with my repeated disobedience and my repeated rebellion, then we wouldn't have random violence because we would have this agreed upon channel to correct me and to put me back in my place. Yes.
One of the things that really struck me about this is that he asked you to sign something saying that you were agreeing to this.
Yeah, so, you have to write it in your own hand too. So it's a contract to agree to hold him not accountable. And that's a thing that they talked about on the forum.
Right.
That was an idea given to him.
So that you couldn't go to the authorities and say that you were being abused, that you'd agreed to it. And tell me why that is actually not consent.
Well, the whole thing's coerced. I mean, you're provided with a script. You're told what to write. You're told when to sign it. And it teaches you also to betray yourself because you can see in your own handwriting that you're doing this thing.
Yeah.
And is very powerful.
Yeah. And also you can't have consent when you're already already under a structure of obedience.
That's right.
So you have to sign it.
It's a power dynamic. Like, what was I going to do? There was no opportunity for me to say no. And so at this point, I did go out and ask for help. And the answer I got from my church was, you need to honor him more. We see this all the time, ma'am. You need to honor him more. And I couldn't believe that. So, I had just told my most embarrassing secret, thinking I would be saved and rescued.
It was interesting that they didn't have like a quantifiable place, but they seemed like the police of that structure.
Right, exactly. It's like the negative space in the clouds. We should provide that graphic in your show notes because it's a really powerful visual. And
they're pulling the strings.
And they are pulling the strings, and they're out there doing their thing. And it's one of the big problems there is in the whole system is that there's no accountability for the leadership. You can't go to anything. Like if you have a problem, you're supposed to, there's a whole structure in the Bible that for conflict resolution. And if someone has offended you, then you have to take two witnesses and you have to go to your brother directly.
I saw that
and all of that.
Which one was that?
Jehovah's Witness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You had to have two witnesses. It was crazy.
2 witnesses. And so if you have a problem and you want to address it, you have to follow those rules. Well, those are the people who are harming you.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And then when you go to your pastor, he's going to sanction what's happening to you. I call it church sanctioned domestic abuse because that's what it is. They were sanctioning what was happening to me. And they were saying this is actually God's design for marriage. And so my message was, you should obey. If you don't want to be spanked, obey your husband.
There were so many times, we're only 3 years apart.
Right.
And one of the things I love about your book is that you root the story in like pop culture at the time. And you're like Fleetwood Mac and Debbie Gibson and like all these things, who, by the way, I worked with on a Hallmark film once.
For real?
For real. And she's super cool.
Oh my God.
Yeah, she's super cool. Sidebar. That was a real dream come true.
Yeah.
But knowing that this was happening to you and I was like, we were alive in the same universe at the same time and like in totally different parts of the world, but like I wanted to like just get to you and like travel back in time and like pull you out, like for you to Canada.
You're playing that scenario.
Yeah, totally in plain sight.
Completely.
And that one of our normal questions is like, what were the red flags you had along the way? And when did you first have doubts? But you had doubts like the whole time.
Well, I think it was,
I did.
I'm convinced it was because you didn't grow up.
I am too.
Yeah.
I am too. And I wanted differently for my life.
Yeah.
And
you knew other.
I read. And so, and there were ideas that people didn't know that I knew because they hadn't read the same books.
Right.
Reading is so subversive. And
you had contacts that no one else your age probably did.
No wonder you and Danielle are friends.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And reading, that's why book bans really matter.
Yeah.
It matters that people have access.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why shaming social media is a huge danger because my life was saved by women on the internet. They saved me. I got in a forum of my own, women had forums too. And nobody knew I was in this forum. And it was literally called Trapdoor and it provided me a trapdoor. What it did was it showed me other lifestyles, the other options I didn't know existed because I'd been so sheltered and then further isolated as we go through my story that I would have no way of knowing if I didn't have a computer in my house, I would have no way of knowing that there's another way to be female. There's another way to be a Christian. There's another way to be free.
And you're not alone.
And I didn't choose it. I don't want to paint it like I felt like I had options and I chose one. No, I escaped a life or death situation after being held hostage for 4 hours. I almost died. And there was no, I'm leaving for a better life. All I was trying to do was save my children's lives. I couldn't, I'm so used to saying unalive myself on social media. I could not let myself die by suicide because of my children. And I could not allow them to be harmed to that point. And I realized the system I was raising them in, that I was so complicit that I would be creating the next generation of abusers.
This podcast is brought to you by Citizens of Sound, a podcast production agency committed to developing and launching shows with gravity and depth. From conception to launch, Citizens will partner with you every step of the way, whether you're an actor, business owner, doctor, fitness coach, hairstylist, or influencer. Connection is the future of communication. Jump on board with Citizens of Sound today and start your show. Go to citizensofsound.com and follow them on Instagram. And trust me, it'll be a really good decision for you.
Okay, everybody, we're going to take a little break there. And we'll see you next week for part 2. And if you haven't watched Shiny Happy People, you can check that out. Again, Tia's story is not the Duggars, but it's a lot of overlaps.
Parallel, for sure.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week. Bye for now.
Sinking down to the depths of the ocean, I'm hanging on to the weight of my love. If I let go of it all, I could leave, but I know I won't.
Hope you like this episode. Let's keep the conversation going and come hang out with us on Patreon, where we keep the tape rolling each week with special episodes just for Patreon subscribers and where we get deep into the weeds of unpacking every episode of The Vow.
And if you're looking for our show notes or some sweet, sweet swag or official ALBC podcast merch or a list of our most recommended cult recovery resources, visit our website at alittlebitculty.com.
And for more background on what brought us here, check out Sarah's page-turning memoir. It's called Scarred, the true story of how I escaped NXIVM, the cult that bound my life. It's available on Amazon, Audible, narrated by my wife, and at most bookstores.
A Little Bit Culty is a Talkhouse podcast and a Trace 120 production. We're executive produced by Sarah Edmondson and Anthony Nippy Ames, with writing, research, and additional production support by senior producer Jess Tardy. We're edited, mixed, and mastered by our rocking producer Will Rutherford of Citizens of Sound, and our amazing theme song, Cultivated, is by John Bryant and co-written by Nigel Asselin. Thank you for listening.